Now, before we leave the Great Depression, I have another question related to the New Deal, which is often claimed as helping all Americans. But in your book, you point out how money was passed out to political allies and New Deal employees who were actually forced to support FDR. How bad was the cronyism in the New Deal, and how did they get away with it?
Well, the United States Senate did an audit of New Deal spending during the New Deal, and one of the things they found is that in many states, people were literally required to change their voter registration from Republican to Democrat if they wanted a government job. So a lot of that sort of thing went on. In some states, they were required to donate to the Democratic Party a certain percentage of their pay in return for getting the government job, and if they didn't do that, they would not get the job. And then there's been a lot of research in economics showing that the main determinants of where New Deal money was spent was how big FDR's electoral margins were in the previous election. Wherever he had slim margins, where he barely won a state, that state would generally do much better in terms of getting government money for various make-work projects, after that election as an effort to win votes. And so as a result, the poorest part of the country, the Mississippi Delta, got very little government money compared to California and other places where Roosevelt needed the votes. After all, by the 1930s, the southern states were still very heavily Democratic because they would never, ever vote for the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party. So FDR did not need to worry much about the Deep South. They was a solid Democrat, but he had to buy votes elsewhere, and so that was the main determinant of how New Deal spending was done. And it's similar to what's going on today. Obama's stimulus, so-called, is primarily aimed at vote buying. That's why it was written into that law that the majority of the money would not be spent until this year, the election year, even though the law was passed a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm. Now, Drew, earlier, before the show started, we were talking about, you had a question related to the Obama administration and a phrase that Tom had coined in an earlier writing called fascism. Would you go ahead and ask that question?
Yeah, well, Tom, last year in one of your writings on LouRockwell.com, you coined a phrase called, to describe the Obama administration, fascism, which is kind of a combination, or I guess a portmanteau of socialism and fascism. My question is, after going through, 12 years of public education, hearing about what's socialism and fascism, they're seemingly opposite. How can two seemingly opposite philosophies, I guess, work together?
Well, they're not the opposite. Fascism was simply a type of socialism. All of the philosophers of fascism were socialists and Marxists first, and they just created a slightly different variant of socialism. So they're really partners, ideological partners. And what economic fascism was in Europe in the 1920s and 30s was private enterprise was allowed to exist, but it was so heavily controlled and regimented by government that it was forced to perform functions that were only the functions that were okayed or given approval of.
Tom, I'm going to have to interrupt you again. We're taking our last break. Please stay with us, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and with me, Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo and Mr. Drew Hjelm. So, Drew, go ahead with the next question.
Yes, hi, Tom. So during the 1970s, after, going to Vietnam and, with the going to Vietnam and running budget deficits, the Nixon administration decided to forget all the lessons Americans had learned from government intervention and the New Deal and the elongation of the Great Depression because of it. And so the Nixon administration imposed price and wage controls, which caused massive crises in the American economy, one of which was the oil crisis. What were some of the effects of these government interventions on the economy?
Well, Nixon put price controls on everything as a re-election ploy. And then after he was re-elected in 1972, he lifted them on a lot of things, but not petroleum. And so when the Arab oil embargo came and the price of petroleum skyrocketed up because of that, we had price controls and normally price ceiling. Normally what would have happened was that the price would have gone up and that would have created tremendous incentives to drill for more oil in America, which would have happened, and that would have caused the price to go right back down. There wouldn't have been any crisis. There wouldn't have been any shortages as long as prices can adjust up and down. And of course, I think it also coincided with the birth of the modern environmentalist movement. So there was a lot of political pressure also to prohibit drilling for oil for environmental reasons. And so it was perfectly fine with a large part of the Washington establishment, most of the Democratic Party, that American oil companies were not getting us out of this crisis because they didn't want energy. Period. That's the anti-energy industry. There was a whole industry there, and so yes, that's what created the massive shortages. And also, so the government came in and did all sorts of foolish things, like if you've ever tried to park your car in one of those little parking spots that says "compact cars only," that was a result of the government policies of the 1970s. They thought that would force us all to buy smaller cars and save gasoline. The 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was a result of all this, and of course nothing worked. The only thing that worked that ended the energy crisis was the deregulation of the price of oil in 1980 and 81. And as soon as that happened, it was the very first thing Ronald Reagan did after he was inaugurated, is to issue an executive order making it immediate, the deregulation of the price of oil. We had one of the biggest oil production booms in the history of America in the next several years. And there was talk even of a depression in Texas and Oklahoma because the price of oil had gone down so much.
So, one of the best things about your book is how you discuss the never-ending war on capitalism. And given that the anti-capitalistic mentality is extremely popular among many people today, how can we break this mold among Americans when they are saturated day and night by this really very silly message in the mainstream media?
Yeah, well, education is what I do, of course, by writing my books and teaching and so forth, and the radio shows are a great help. Television is a great help. There are a few shows out there now that try to spread the word. John Stossel has always been very good on television the last 15 years or so on his economic reporting and in his documentaries, and that's our only hope, I think, because government so dominates the educational system. Most people are brainwashed into anti-capitalism by the government schools. What else would you expect by government schools? And they tell us the false story that we're all about to be victimized by the civil society and by the free market, and we need government to protect us. But it's really government that harms us by interfering with the free market.
Right, and with peaceful cooperation that the free market allows.
That's right.
Yeah. So, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo and Mr. Drew Hjelm, for being with us today. This has been an excellent show, and I greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Great. So this is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com, where you can download this and all of our shows for free. And until next week, folks, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom.